Hello, everybody. So, for those of you who are wondering, this is a political map of the Seven Kingdoms as of the end of Season 7, heading into Season 8, the last season. And as you can see, red is Stark Targaryen. And I'm glad that they did that because Jon Snow has pledged himself to Daenerys Targaryen, and they're probably going to get married in the next season. So, whether you want to say he's a vassal or it's going to be a personal union or whatever, they are basically allied at the moment. The Eyrie is kind of an interesting question. They have it as part of Stark Targaryen, but with Littlefinger dead, I don't really know who's in charge of the Vale at this time. I guess Sweet Robin is still the ruler of it technically, but he's a minor and mentally incompetent. So I don't know. Is Sansa the regent now? Is the Royces? Is some other House of the Vale regent? I don't really know, but they have it as part of the Stark Targaryen. I don't know how that's going to work out, but I think that's fair enough. The Vale army is definitely helping them for the moment, but the political structure of it is very hard to tell. Then we have the Lannisters, which are in yellow, of course. Why they have the Targaryens in red and the Lannisters in yellow, I'm not sure. You'd think the Targaryens should be black, maybe? That wouldn't look very good. Okay, I see why they did that. Anyways, the Lannisters are gold and red as their colors. So Lannisters are in yellow, and then I really like what they did here where gray is we're not really sure. Because a lot of these places don't have central political authority anymore because the ruling house is extinct. Like as of the end of Season 7, the Reach has no ruling family. Dorne has no ruling family. Littlefinger's dead, so who knows what the status of Harrenhal is. And the Freys, despite being made the Lord Paramounts of the Riverlands, were wiped out by Arya, so we have no idea what their status is. Also, obviously, the Iron Isles have joined in on the Lannister side, and there will probably eventually be a personal union. So what I found really interesting and kind of one of the high points of Season 7 for me is I think we were all expecting Daenerys to just show up and completely curb stomp the Lannisters. Because to be fair, the Lannisters are basically exhausted at this point. They've done the bulk of the fighting for their side of the war. Whereas the Tyrells didn't really do that much. They kind of showed up after the fighting was over. And while they've managed to take control of the Stormlands, the Riverlands, and parts of the Reach, a lot of those areas are very depleted, and their rule over them is very tenuous at best. So you would have expected the exhausted Lannisters to just kind of immediately roll over and play dead. But after her coup, Cersei actually appears to be doing the first smart thing in her life, which is she didn't get involved at all in military policy. She let Jaime, Euron, and Randall Tarley run the war for her, and all three of them are pretty competent military commanders. So they were actually able to handle things, and her staying out of it meant that the Lannisters' side actually did pretty well. So as of the moment, I'd say the war is inconclusive. I don't think either side necessarily has an advantage over the other, like a decisive one. I would say the current balance of power is leaning more towards the Lannisters, and we'll go into detail about that. So at the moment, the Lannisters have their depleted army. They have whatever they can raise from the Westerlands, which I think it's implied that they've had to resort to conscription and very kind of low-level conscription. Just young people, peasants, people who aren't really qualified to be soldiers. I think most of the professional army and their bannermen are dead at this point. The Crownlands, I'd imagine, are also pretty beat up, but I think they're fairly loyal to the Iron Throne at this point. So she can raise some troops from there, and I think you can probably raise some from the Stormlands, because with the Baratheon line extinct and the Stormlands supposedly occupied, I don't really know who else they're going to align to at this point. The interesting case is what's going on with the Reach, because with Dickon and Randall dead, they do have there is one member of House Tarly left who's the younger sister of Sam and Dickon, who's technically the heir to House Tarly, and she would technically be the Lady Paramount of the of the Reach. But the question is, does anyone acknowledge that? I think to a certain extent, people were willing to acknowledge Randall Tarly because he was very prestigious and he was widely respected. And the Tarleys are one of the stronger houses in the Reach. And with the Tyrells extinct, there wasn't the logical successor was really either the Tarleys or the Hightowers. And I'm not really sure if the Hightowers are interested in ruling the Reach. I guess the Red Wines also. So the Hightowers are generally pretty happy just doing their own thing, being like the richest house in the Seven Kingdoms. So I don't really know what the status of the Reach is at the moment. As for the Targaryens, their situation is interesting. The North has utterly depleted manpower. The largest kind of remaining military force in the North was the Wildlings, I guess, and the Boltons, because Roose Bolton had basically rigged it so his soldiers took very few casualties during the War of Five Kings, whereas all the other northern kingdoms took very heavy casualties. So the Bolton army had been largely intact, but after the Battle of the Bastards, they've been reduced to almost nothing. Also, the remaining loyal northern bannermen more or less have been wiped out from a combination of Robb Stark's wars, the Civil War in the North, and the Ironborn invasion. So the military capacity at the North is completely devastated at the moment. The Vale has their army completely intact. They've taken virtually no casualties. They also have their grain supplies entirely intact. So they have a good army. The Vale is not very heavily populated, but it's noted for having very strong traditions of chivalry, equal to the Reach. So I would imagine, pound for pound, they have some of the best soldiers in all of Westeros. Also, as they said in the show, they're trained to fight in cold, which is very important at this point in time. So just looking at the Westerosi situation, I guess we should mention Dorne. So with the extinction of the Martells, there's no clear successor. Maybe the Yarnwoods will take over, but I don't really see any. I kind of feel like Dorne's just going to fall apart into its constituent parts. The great prestige of the Martells, particularly that they were a combination of, well, the Martells and Nymerios, I think held Dorne together. And kind of without either the Sand Snakes, I don't think the Sand Snakes really commanded very much of Dorne, to be honest. Because I feel like killing the Prince of Dorne, Doran Martell is very popular and very widely respected as like a statesman and a wise ruler. And Tristan didn't do anything. Like Tristan, like was I would assume also well liked, and they just killed him for no reason. So I'd imagine their rule was very unpopular, and now they're dead. So I don't really know if any of the remaining lords in Dorne are interested in carrying on the war. So that's kind of the Westerosi situation. I think the Lannisters probably have a bit of an advantage in terms of their military power. They also, I think, have a bit of a positional advantage because they hold most of the realm's castles. And castles are very difficult to take, especially during the winter. Because even, I guess a lot of them have been sacked, but I'd imagine most of them at least have some grain stores left. And having to march south and siege castles. As for the Iron Isles, we really have no idea what their military capacity is at this point. The Iron Fleet appears to be almost entirely intact, but I don't know how many actual soldiers they have to field. However, having a good navy really paid off as of Season 7. So then that brings us to kind of the dragon in the room, the Targaryens' Essos forces. So that would be the Dothraki and the Unsullied. Now, my personal opinion is neither of them are particularly useful, and I think in a lot of ways they're actually detriments. As Tyrion rightfully pointed out, unleashing a race of savage rapists to pillage and plunder the Seven Kingdoms isn't really a good way to build local support or to get people on your side. How many Dothraki there actually are, they say like 100,000 or 60,000 or 80,000. Who knows what the actual number is? Troop numbers are very hard to determine during this time period in real life because the actual number of fighting men is very subjective because you have squires who sometimes fight. You have like blacksmiths and people who like camp followers. You have peasant levies and knights, and a knight's worth like 20 or 30 peasant levies by and large. So it's kind of, let's say though that the Targaryens have about 60,000 Dothraki. I think they're a net negative because they're basically useless in the type of warfare that they're going to have. The Dothraki don't have siege weapons. There's been no evidence to me that they have siege weapons or they have any sort of way to attack a fortified castle. The Dothraki themselves are atrociously poor fighters. I don't get where they get their reputation from. They don't have lances. They don't have armor. They don't even seem to really use bows. So against like Westerosi soldiers, even ones with basic armor and swords and shields, shields and spears, they should get absolutely slaughtered. Like, I think with regards to the Battle of the Golden Road, or whatever it was, if the dragons hadn't have shown up, the Dothraki would have lost. Because light cavalry can't do anything against heavy infantry with spears and shields. And we saw this during various times during the Islamic conquests and during the Crusades. If Crusaders would dismount, or in the case of the Battle of Tours, dismounted heavily armed infantry, light cavalry can't really do anything against them. Light cavalry also can't do anything against, frankly, heavy cavalry. As we saw this when what was I thinking of? Oh yeah, when the Muslims were fighting the Normans in Sicily, you'd have a couple dozen Norman cavalry that would beat like hundreds or thousands of Muslim cavalry because they didn't wear armor, really. They didn't have heavy weapons. It's very, very hard to kill someone wearing full plate unless you have a lance or crossbows or some other sort of heavy weapon. Even then it's difficult. But the idea that the Dothraki can do basically anything to full plate Westerosi knights is completely absurd. I'd imagine they'd have to get 10-1 or better to stand any sort of chance. There's also the issue that Dothraki are not disciplined. And it's interesting when we have this whole comparison drawn between them and the Mongols, because the Mongols under Genghis Khan at least were extremely disciplined. The Mongols used very sophisticated strategic strategy and tactics. Like when they were fighting the Russians, they were able to, they basically baited the Russian army into chasing them for like 7 days or something like that, and then they ambushed them. And the amount of discipline to do that is incredible. And they would do things like they charge, and then they'd pull back at the last minute and run away so their enemies would break formation. The other thing is, what a lot of people don't realize is the Mongol army composition was about 2/3 cavalry archers and 1/3 heavy cavalry. Something like that. The Mongols extensively used heavy cavalry. As soon as the Mongols had access to armor, they immediately widely adopted it. So Mongol heavy cavalry would have chainmail or lamellar or steel lamellar, or if they could get it, I guess, plate. But they all wore armor of some description. And they had lances, and they were very effective at it. I mean, was their armor as good as Western Knights? No, it probably wasn't. But, like, chainmail is way better than no armor. Chainmail will stop arrows and swords and spears. If you've ever seen, like, good quality riveted mail getting tested, that'll block just about any bladed weapon, even a spear. It'll probably break your bones if you get hit by a spear, but I take broken ribs over being disemboweled by a spear any day. So, like, they aren't really equivalent to the Mongols at all, because the Mongols had a sophisticated military structure. They had very good logistics. They had a good mix of their army. Even their cavalry archers, I would imagine, wore like leather lamellar or scale mail or something. And they had composite bows, which were very useful. They also, I would assume a lot of them had lances as well, but they weren't primarily a charged cavalry. So my point is the Dothraki are just not useful at all. Like, how are they supposed to attack castles? You're going to have unarmored men with crappy, like, sickle swords climbing up siege ladders. Like, it's ridiculous. They're going to get their asses kicked. Like, they can't even really hurt the defending infantry. Like, with normal soldiers who have, like, shields and armor, they still get beaten up pretty badly by archers, but they have absolutely no way to defend themselves from the rocks and arrows being thrown down on them. So it would take an absurd number of them to do anything. And like I said, the only siege weapons they've really been shown to have are like siege ladders, which I won't even reach a lot of castles. There's also the issue of what are they going to eat? It's nice to have a huge army, but this is before we have like trains and cars and refrigeration and all that stuff. Having to feed and equip an arm, feed and otherwise equip an army. By the way, just I thought of it now. The Dothraki don't have cold weather clothing. They don't even wear shirts, and their horses probably aren't very used to the cold either. So you'd think most of them are just going to get frostbite and die. But like when it becomes winter, what are their horses going to eat? Like the grass is going to die and freeze. How are they going to get hay for like 60,000 guys? How are they going to get food for 60,000 guys? Most of the food is either burnt at this point in time or within castles. And the Lannisters also have the same issue with the lack of food, but it's not as bad because they don't have a concentrated army of that size. And I would imagine they have more reserves. So like their castles might not have enough to last the whole winter, but they might have enough to last a couple years. Whereas the Dothraki have basically no logistical support whatsoever. And they have to rely on living off the land, which is basically just sacking and burning everything in their path. And Daenerys, I don't know if she'll let them do it. She probably will because she's a very weak ruler. But it's like, it's a mess. The Unsullied are equally worthless. They're like manlets. They don't have balls, so they have low testosterone. Compared to Westerosi knights, who are like big muscular guys, they kick their asses. Plus, they don't really have armor. They have like crappy leather. They have small shields and spears. Historically, heavy cavalry can just run right through that. I mean, pike formations have trouble stopping heavy cavalry, let alone like their crappy like short spears. They get their asses kicked. Also, if they were fighting close range, they'd also lose. They don't really have any real defense against arrows. They're at least disciplined. But once again, they don't seem to have any cold weather clothing. So they're also largely worthless. The only really good troops that Daenerys has in any numbers at this point is the soldiers of the Vale, and they're up fighting the others in the north. But like the progress of the war so far is the Targaryens have lost like half of their army. With the destruction of House Tyrell and the taking of Highgarden, the largest potential ally, the ally with the largest army in all of Westeros, has basically been knocked out of the war. Similarly, with the extinction of House Tyrell, Tyrell, but House Martell, Dorne is basically out of the war as well. So in a series of like two naval battles, or like one overland campaign and one naval battle, they've essentially halved the size of the Targaryen forces. They've also succeeded in destroying basically all of the Targaryens' naval power. So they don't have the ability to move their armies around by sea anymore, which is one of the single most important things that any power can have. Oftentimes in history, winning on land is outdone by winning at sea. Like, for instance, when the Japanese invaded Korea, they won basically every land battle. They utterly curb stomped them. But the Japanese had very poor quality ships. And the Koreans had much better ships and much better leadership. So they were able to win the war because Japan just wasn't able to supply or move their troops around properly. So the Targaryens have a massive advantage in terms of their fleet at the moment. The Lannisters do. So the only real advantage that the Targaryens have is dragons. Now, Dany has lost one of them, so she only has two of them left. Now let's talk about dragons. Hers aren't super big. They're big, largely because of plot devices, but they're nowhere near as big as Balerion or Vhagar or any of the great dragons of old. And as powerful as dragons are, as we saw in the Battle of the Gold Fork or whatever it's called, or the Gold Road, scorpions work against dragons. Like, they say it didn't do anything, but when they shot the dragon with the scorpion, it pierced its wing and it fell to the ground. It basically neutralized it. So if that's one scorpion, If you have a couple in like batteries and you have them fire in a row, like let's say you have 6 scorpions on the walls of King's Landing, you fire them in rounds of 2, so you have pretty much continuous fire. All you need is a couple bolts to hit a dragon and you'll knock it out of the sky. Even if it doesn't like kill the dragon, if you damage its wings, it might fall to the earth and crash. Dany's the only one who can fly the dragons at the moment. So I don't know how useful they really are. Regardless of that, even if they just shoot arrows, there's a decent chance that one of the arrows will eventually hit her. That happened a number of times. Dragons are a super weapon to be sure, but they're far from like able to win every battle by themselves. And the more you rely on them, the more there's a chance that they're going to stop working. I mean, keep in mind the Targaryens lost against Dorne. Now, the Lannisters don't have that kind of loyalty, but you can't just win by using dragons, especially in this day and age where people know how to fight dragons with scorpions and crossbows and that kind of thing. And if Dany dies, her entire army falls apart and the conquest is over. So I think, and this is all without talking about the others, the Stark Targaryens are kind of screwed because they're going to have to move all their forces up to fight against the others at the wall, whereas the Lannisters aren't going to have to deal with that for quite a while. And they're renting the Golden Company, which is like 10,000 people. So if the Lannisters are smart, I think what they do at this point is they just overrun the rest of the South. The Reach probably won't put up too much of a fight. Dorne, they can at least subject some of the lords and keep them out of the war and just focus on consolidating their power over this half of the kingdoms. Invading the Vale is stupid at this point. The Vale is very easy to defend, and they really aren't in a position to be wasting manpower. And invading the north is an act of madness because of the reeds in Moat Cailin, and there's nothing to be gained from it. So really, if the Lannisters can just retake what's left of the south that's neutral at this point in time, prevent the Targaryens from rebuilding their fleet, and just kind of hold out as long as they can, then they're probably going to win this by default. The Targaryens are in a much more precarious position than them. So that's kind of my thoughts on the military situation as of Season 7. I hope you enjoyed the video, and more to come.